Hello and welcome. I am Dr. Lara May, a clinical pharmacist specializing in functional medicine, as well as a certified yoga teacher and Reiki master. I run a truly integrative health coaching practice encompassing functional medicine lab testing, yoga and meditation, and a sprinkling of Reiki energy medicine. Join me here on Light Body Radio to break through your health plateau and come into alignment with your natural vitality. Hello and welcome to Light Body Radio. I am your host, Dr. Lara May, and today I have with me expert in genetics and rejuvenation, Elwin Robinson. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Elwin, in 2009, developed severe digestive issues which ruined his life, causing constant pain, anxiety, severe weight loss, and countless emergency room visits. And surprisingly, this was despite having owned several health businesses over 10 years and living a lifestyle that was healthier than 99% of people, which is not uncommon, unfortunately. And worst of all, no one he saw, from medical doctors to dozens of different alternative health practitioners, was able to figure out what was going on or help. So in 2021, he discovered the power of genetic testing, which finally gave him some answers that no one else had been able to provide. So now you're on a mission to change the world by empowering people with crucial self-knowledge that helps them to understand and love themselves as they are and become aware of their body's unique needs based on their genetic blueprint. So I'm excited to talk about this. So welcome.
Thank you so much.
So I want to dive a little bit deeper into your story, if you don't mind fleshing that out a little bit, and just telling us, obviously, I think a lot of us can resonate with that. You knew something wasn't right. You definitely had some symptoms. You sought out help from a myriad of practitioners, and no one really had those answers.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not against allopathic medicine, mainstream medicine. It's usually my first port of call, and it wasn't this case. When I started to have that severe pain, I went to a GP, they called over here in England, and I went to private doctors as well. I had MRI, CT scan, all kinds of blood tests, all that kind of stuff. And they just couldn't find anything wrong. They thought there was, they gave me muscle relaxants and painkillers, both of which didn't help at all. In fact, to begin with, they gave me an opioid painkiller, which made it substantially worse. There are some, it turns out there are some issues, I'm sure you know this, the pharmacist, opiates not only don't work on, but they actually make it way worse. And I was one of those people. So yeah, I tried a lot of other stuff, though, a lot of alternative stuff, including functional medicine. And, because it was a pain issue, I didn't know, maybe it's something structural. So I went to see osteopaths and craniosacrotherapists and acupuncturists and all the rest of it. But yeah, no one was able to work out what was going on with me. And, I spent, I'd say, a good several years in constant pain. And I know there's a lot of people in pain, but most people are using painkillers to manage that pain. But as I said, unfortunately, the painkillers just didn't work for me. So it was, quite unpleasant. And so going on to genetics was really the first thing that actually provided me some answers as to what was going on with me. And it didn't provide all the answers. I still had to go off and after that and kind of double check that it was correct with further testing, but it gave clues, I would say, that helped me to finally resolve what the issue was.
That's fascinating. So I want to start by just sort of maybe asking some questions too about the difference in genetic tests, because a lot of people have done like Ancestry or 23andMe, and I think those are probably like the two most well-known probably, but there's so many out there now. Is one better than the other? Or if you do one that's like Ancestry, can you still use that one for your for health information?
Yeah, it's a good question. So ironically, the well-known, I guess, kind of cheaper ones, at least value ones like Ancestry and 23andMe, are actually the best option. They test loads of stuff. So when you go to a practitioner, often they just test a few what are called SNPs for a specific purpose. And I mean, that's fair enough if you're just trying to hone in on something specific. But with 23andMe, they don't do the whole genome, but they do enough of it that we can then take that information. A service like ours, and we're not the only ones. Obviously, I think we're the best, but there are many other services out there, to be honest, that can take that information from somewhere like 23andMe and process it and then provide you with all kinds of insights. And that was my experience. I did 23andMe back in 2013, back when I was still feeling great. My wife and I both did it. There was no real surprises there, both fairly European in our ancestry. And I kind of just forgot about it. And then, when I was suffering with this issue, I saw this thing that said, if you have done these things before, you can upload your data from them. And within a few hours, you can get all of this information. And back then I was doing all kinds of testing on myself. And as you know, tests are often very expensive, difficult, painful. A lot of people don't want to, get blood drawn. So the idea that I could, in the comfort of my own home, get all this testing information without having to do any of that was very, very interesting. So that's one of the reasons why I did it. And I was blown away with how accurate it was. I've never been to, I would say, well, I've kind of been to a psychic once that really surprised me and impressed me with how much they knew about me. And I've been to a lot of those kind of people in my life. A lot of the time it's other people saying you've got to see this person. I'm like, not really impressed. But with this, it was actually the most impressive example of that. It almost felt like it was like a psychic, like it knew all these things about me. And the thing that was crazy to me was that back in 2013, when I first did that test, it was a saliva test, as these things usually are. I didn't have most of these health issues, and yet it could see in the genetics that I was going to get them. And I was like, wow, if only I'd have known that back then, I could have actually prevented a lot of these issues, or at least made them less severe. So yeah, to answer your question, really any kind of ancestry test, which tests a decent part of the genome, they test millions of SNPs, they are good enough for a service like ours to use. And so what we do, just to give a distinction, we take that and we have an AI engine that's built and maintained by several dozen full-time AI engineers, several dozen full-time research scientists. So that's what's behind it, and that's why we can take that data and give you all of this insight that maybe another company, including ironically 23andMe or Ancestry, despite them having so much, I don't know, money behind them or whatever, they're just not focused on health and wellness and well-being. They give you a few reports, a couple of things that you get at public
very
speaking,
superficial.
but yeah, it's very, very little information compared to what a company like ours can give.
And I'm sorry, I don't think I mentioned the company before when I was reading your bio. So your company is Genetic Insights. So just for everyone out there, so you're not confused about who and what we're talking about. The company name is Genetic Insights. And so, and also just to be clear too, in terms of, and you sort of mentioned it, how the process works. So you take the information that Ancestry or 23andMe has processed, and then you guys have sort of like a database or that you submit the information into, and it spits out oh, these are your SNPs. These are, what you're likely to develop or see develop, right? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that you mentioned about SNPs. See, there are a lot of companies out there that all they do, it's a bit like, like those personality tests where they ask you these stuff and then they basically just repeat back to you what you've just said to them. So a lot of the genetic tests are kind of like that. So they'll look at it and they'll go, oh, here's one SNP and this means this. So there are many, many companies like that. There are far fewer companies like ours. So what we will do is calculate lots and lots of different variables and give you an overall risk score and overall recommendation. So for instance, on our heart health report, in order to come to a conclusion about what your risk is of potentially having heart health issues, we're calculating over 1 million SNPs. So a lot of companies out there, they're just saying, oh, you have this MTHFR, you have COMT, you have whatever, and therefore you have an increased risk of heart issues or whatever. And we're going, no. I mean, occasionally we have reports where it's only based on one SNP. I'm not discounting that, but I'm saying a lot of the time with something complex like heart health or like your chance of getting an infection or this and that, there's actually loads of SNPs that are involved in whether that might be an issue or not. And so we're actually calculating them all, weighing them against each other and coming to a holistic conclusion. And I'd say that's how we're different from a lot of, even probably, I don't want to say anything negative about anything, but more well-known companies that they are just checking a handful of SNPs and then kind of repeating that information back to you. But honestly, if you knew how to search your raw DNA file from one of these companies, which is on the Mac it's just Command F, you could just search, you could actually come up with that information yourself. Like what we do, you could never do yourself again unless you had a very advanced AI computing system, because we're actually crunching the numbers, comparing them all against each other, and then coming to like a conclusion.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I like that. So cool. No, that answers a lot of questions for me too, especially even as a practitioner. And I do have practitioners that listen to this show also. So I love to bring in both, information that'll help the consumer, the layperson, and the practitioner, and including myself, because if my client has already spent the time and the money to send in their sample and get the information back, then I love utilizing that information and, putting together a plan for a client. A lot of people haven't done it yet. And so just that time that it takes to submit and get it back, sometimes that's almost, it's easier to just get started with, which is going to lead me to my next question, the lifestyle modifications, the changing of the diet, and making sure you're getting enough sleep, doing other testing like you alluded to, which can be expensive. And so that's also too why, I sort of come up with a two-pronged approach for my clients is, this would be the path if we did the testing. This would be the path if we didn't. Very often they're not that different. And so depending on financially where they are, I give them the option. Now, if we get down the road, like with you, and we've done all the right things, and the client is very compliant, as we say, and, very motivated, but still not getting better, then, then I can suggest this next step. All right, like we've done all the other things. Now we need to dig deeper. So what would you say is maybe quote unquote more important? The genetic path or the lifestyle, or can you really separate the two? What's your approach to that?
It's a really good question. I do agree with you. I think for most people, maybe not most people listening to this kind of podcast, admittedly, but most of the general population, if they just apply a bunch of lifestyle, maybe dietary changes to themselves, maybe simple supplements that are beneficial for almost everyone, like magnesium or something like that, then that can be a lot of benefit for them. I do think that services like this are more, I hate to use the word needed, but important, let's just say, for people who are not in that category, who are more like, my story was like, I've tried everything, I've seen all these different practitioners, and I haven't been able to find the solution. And of course, a lot of those people do end up listening to my podcast or your podcast. So for a lot of people listening to us, that is relevant. But I agree, for a lot of the general population, if they just drink less alcohol and stop smoking and don't eat fast food as much and all the rest of it, and start moving, walk every day, all of that basic stuff, get some sunlight, get some fresh air, I mean, that is very helpful, and that's possibly all they need to start feeling pretty good. Now for those kind of quote unquote normal people who are not hard work like me, like I was as a client, is there any value in our service? I would say yes, but it's different. Our service then, rather than being helpful to kind of tease out the mystery of what's going on and why nothing's working, our service is more helpful in the sense of, first of all, helping to prevent issues coming about. I mentioned heart health earlier. There's blood sugar, there's mental health, there's all these kinds of issues that potentially could lead to problems. And just to give you an idea of what our service has, it has around 300 health risk reports. It has about 60 nutrient need reports. So every vitamin, every mineral, every amino acid, every essential fat, allergies and intolerances, different toxins that you may be more likely to have an issue with. And then we do individual genes as well. So all of that is useful information for prevention and also for optimization, Like, for instance, just to give an example for me, I have an elevated need for choline. So choline, I know that you know, but for the audience is
Yes, please explain. Yeah.
is a nutrient that used to be considered to be, I think, one of the B vitamins, but then they realized the body can make it itself, so they downgraded it. But that, it's still a semi-conditionally essential nutrient. I actually think this is a little bit of a mistake. I know that the body can make its own, but some people cannot make it their own as well as others, and this is based on a specific genetic SNP, a specific genetic variant. And honestly, most foods don't contain much choline except for egg yolk and liver. I mean, I can't think of anything else that you're going to get a decent amount of choline from. I know that, they extract it from sunflower seeds and soy, so this is true, but it's quite problematic eating large amounts of seeds or soy. It has, its own potential issues. So it's actually very hard to get enough choline. Now, I never liked eggs, so I never had egg yolks, never liked liver. And I was vegan for a while. So I spent probably 20 years having barely any choline in my diet. And I have that genetic variant that means I need 2 to 3 times more choline than the average person. Now, that led me to a situation where I developed cholestasis, which is where the bile doesn't flow properly and gets stuck, which led to that pain condition. I had something very unusual, especially for men, I'm sure you know it, called sphincter of Oddi dysfunction. And this is kind of downstream initially of cholestasis. I can't be sure, but I don't think I would ever have developed that problem in the first place if I'd have just had enough choline in my diet. Now, because it was so far gone, I had to do more than just choline to kind of reverse the situation. But that's just one example of just like, I've seen this with lots of different people. Like if you have an elevated need for, magnesium, for instance, I've seen people with crippling anxiety who have an elevated need for magnesium, or even for glycine. I've seen that sometimes. And as soon as they start getting that nutrient, they start feeling better. They start being able to relax. The anxiety goes down. I've seen people with an elevated need for iron and B12 who lost lots of weight as a result of starting to take that, or healing a crippling pain condition. I've seen people with an elevated need for an amino acid called L-tyrosine who were able to heal their depression just by increasing tyrosine. So that's the kind of thing. Again, I'm giving more examples of where it helped someone because it's a bit more
that's great,
illustrative. But the point is, it could prevent as often as it would resolve. Like meaning if you know that you need it, then even if you haven't got the problem yet, you can hopefully not get it in the first place.
Well, and I love your first example because so many people, especially in the Western world, and I know definitely the US, they have their gallbladder just, taken out because, oh, that's an organ that you don't really need. But turns out it actually serves a very important function. And once you remove it, a lot of people have, are then, left with more problems because they've removed that organ that is so important in digesting fats in the body. So I would not say that having your gallbladder removed is a minor thing to do. So I love that that's the first example that you gave, and obviously very personal and close to home for you. Wow, yeah. So I think this is really important for a lot of people to consider. It's not just about the fine tuning or fixing something that's acutely wrong, because I think that's where a lot of people get in their journey. At first, it's what's acutely wrong, what are the big things that are like right here in front of my face, or, oh, I've been on this journey for a long time and now I just like want to fine tune. I'm still not feeling great here. Why is that? So I want to dig a little deeper. So I think this information is extremely powerful for prevention. One of the things that I am curious about from your perspective and your experience in terms of, I would love to know if you've looked into anything with Alzheimer's, because I know they meaning even Western medicine likes to look at your genetic makeup in terms of a predictor for your risk of Alzheimer's. Has your company delved into that at all and seen trends or correlations or anything like that?
Yeah, we do have a report for that. I would have I worked with anyone with Alzheimer's? No, so I can't say that I've actually seen that in person, unfortunately.
But usually, yeah, by the time we see it, it's too late anyway. So unfortunately,
yeah, and we can't say it's helped prevent it in someone, of course, because we never know. It's not
yeah.
something that's guaranteed to happen anyway. But my understanding of Alzheimer's is a buildup of arterial plaque is one of the big
one of the pathogens.
One of the big contributors towards it. I know there's other things like inflammation. So I would be looking at like those two things specifically. I think they're the primary things that I would look at to start with. And so I wouldn't only look at an Alzheimer's report in that case, for instance. I would also look at the heart health, the cardiovascular health report, and I would even be looking at nutrients again. Like, for instance, I see a lot of people who have increased need for vitamin K2. And so in that case, I'm like, you really need to get on it with this. And I've seen people whose blood pressure has gone down as a result of utilizing vitamin K2, just, as an example. Nattokinase, I'm a big, believer in any of those kind of enzymes as well to, reduce the clotting. So between helping to reduce the excessive clotting and between reducing the arterial plaque, and then inflammation is a bit more complicated. I wouldn't put it down to, just one nutrient or anything. Yeah, unfortunately. but I would relate it to the detox capacity a little bit. So I would be looking at like, what is the body potentially overloaded with toxicity wise? And that was one of the big breakthroughs for me, is I discovered that my body was not good at detoxifying lead. And so because of that, I decided to spring for a blood test. As I'm sure you know, a lead blood test is not particularly cheap or easy to get. But I decided to do it. And my lead levels were like 27 micrograms per deciliter, which, if the reference range is 0 to 3, and then 45 is what's considered a medical emergency. So it's closer to medical emergency than 95% of the, being close to 95% of the population. And that was the thing that was really creating systemic inflammation for me, because otherwise, as I said, I had no reason to have, I had not drinking, not smoking, not eating any processed food, not eating any, not drinking any tap water, only using organic clothing. I mean, when I said my lifestyle was healthier than 99% of people, it really was in pretty much every dimension. But it turned out that I still had lead in my system, and that the half-life of lead is 20 years. And my understanding from reading the World Health Organization report is that it gets stored in the bones, and then it slowly kind of just leaches into your bloodstream. And so I think because my wife, who I'd lived with and shared everything with for about 10 years, also had a test, and her lead was almost nothing. And
that's interesting.
It was only 1. Between 1 and 3, it was 1. So it wasn't due to recent exposure, was the conclusion that we came to. And speaking of failures of the mainstream medical profession, when I went to my doctor and told him about that, my mainstream medical doctor, he said, I said, oh, well, first of all, they didn't believe it, so they had to retest using their own test, and they saw it was as high. And then when they finally had it confirmed that it was that high, I said, could this be the cause of all my problems? Because one of the symptoms listed for lead, one of the first symptoms, is abdominal pain, mysterious abdominal pain. And he said, yeah, it could be. And I said, okay, so what are we going to do about it? And he said, well, we'll retest it in a year. I said, anything else?
What?
No, that was all that they were willing to consider. So that's an example of where I was living the healthy lifestyle, but my body was actually flooded with this thing, which of course would create inflammation, and which over time could lead to arterial plaque buildup and blood clotting, platelet buildup and all the rest of it. And that's something I never would have known if it weren't for doing testing. So that's where again, I am a big fan of testing when there's like these mysterious things going on, and I'm a big fan of genetic testing. Obviously, that's what I do first, just to kind of narrow it down. Because, of course, when there is systemic inflammation, there's so many different things that it could be. And so with, genetics, it will help. Is it likely to be food allergy? That's another example. I always thought I had food intolerances, because there's all these foods that when I ate them, I'd have a reaction. I do my genetic testing. It turned out the only thing that I genetically have a tendency towards an intolerance towards is gluten. But everything else, all the other foods I reacted to. And I was like, well, that's not. I just thought the genetics were wrong, honestly. But then I started to resolve the liver congestion issue, the systemic inflammation issue, hypothyroid issue, which I also had and had a genetic tendency towards. I started resolving all that. And then suddenly all these foods were okay again. And I realized I never had kind of food intolerances. What I actually probably had was like a chronic systemic infection in my gut, which was exacerbated by all these things. And so it's helpful as well sometimes to find out that you don't actually have a specific issue, if that makes sense.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. So are you of the school that because we have certain SNPs, we're predetermined to develop certain things, or do you still think that there's, I guess, the possibility of not developing the issue? Like if you're, like your genetic test comes back, even if you're, like homozygous or something, which means like you have, the two pairs of the alleles. Can you go into that a little bit so people, like, is this sort of like a prescription for you're definitely destined to have A, B, or C, or there's still a chance that you won't? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think on the SNP level, if you're homozygous, meaning that both of your parents have passed on the same thing to you, then you are going to have that. But in terms of health outcomes, lifestyle outcomes, in terms of how you're going to feel, in terms of your risk of developing certain diseases or whatever, it's definitely not set in stone. So if all our reports were able to do was give you risk scores, I never would have started this business, because I'm not in the business of telling people, in which dimension they are, for want of a better word, screwed. That's not what we're about. Like, we offer that so that you know what to prioritize and focus on. But the other thing that we have in most cases in our reports, except for when we can't do it because there's no scientific evidence to support it, is recommendations. And the vast majority of the content of our report is recommendations. So the recommendations are based on your genetics. So there's lifestyle recommendations, dietary recommendations, supplement recommendations. Like, the only reason that we have recommendations in there in the first place is because you can change your percentage chance of developing a certain issue. And in fact, I see this over and over again, Dr. May. I work with a lot of people, probably from two opposite extremes. I work with a lot of people who have tried everything and nothing's worked, like I was. But I've also worked with a lot of people like yourself who are highly dedicated to health and have been for a long time, like health influencers. And it's interesting, when I go through health influencers reports, I always I'm not looking forward to it as much, because it's much harder to impress them, because most of basically, I'll put it this way, like, with some of our reports, we can give a percentage risk score. So, your top 1% most likely to get this, top 5, top 10, whatever. When I do that with quote unquote normal people, by the time they're in their late 30s to 40s, they have developed most of the issues that are in the top percentile. So if I say you've got high risk of that, they go, wow, yeah, that's true. Wow, yeah, that's true. And it seems very impressive how accurate we are. Now, if I do that with the health influencers, often that's not the case. And I go through it and they're like, no, I don't have that. No, I don't have that. I'm like, oh, wow, okay. But then when we look at the recommendations, they're doing recommendation number 1, recommendation number 2, recommendation number 3. And I'm like, well, there you go. That's why you never develop that issue, whereas most people would, because you have already been following a lot of these recommendations for a long time. And so I've seen, I don't know, probably 100 examples of each case. The influencers where they have been following most of the recommendations and they haven't developed the problem. And then the other side, the normal people who are not able to commit themselves full time to their health because they, have lives and jobs and families and all the rest. And so
we're human.
Yeah. And so they haven't been able to do all this, big list of recommendations. And so they have developed the problem. So yeah, I'm absolutely convinced that we can make a huge difference in it. Often I'm asked about this, like, philosophically, it's like fate versus free will or something like that. And I used to be very much in the free will camp. I used to totally believe, you're the captain of your own destiny. You can create your own reality. Like, I hated the idea of being held back by your past or your genetics or anything. And so it's ironic that I've ended up being in this sphere of teaching genetics. But, what I've realized is it is helpful to know the cards that you've been dealt genetically, because sometimes there are things you don't know about, and then also sometimes you may assume things. Like, my mother had cancer several times and died young. There are various things that I thought I was kind of doomed with, despite having this mentality. I just kind of assumed, and then looking into it, actually these are things that maybe often haven't been passed down to me, which is like a real relief. So it's very helpful to know the cards you've been dealt with, both in terms of maybe a relief of realizing you haven't had something passed on from a relative, but on the other side as well, if you have had something passed on, it can really help you to have compassion with yourself and to go, like for instance, I see a lot of people who want to lose weight. If we look at their report and they are more likely to be overweight, they're more likely to struggle to keep the weight off. So they're more likely to regain the weight once they've lost it. If I say that to someone, yes, it's bad news because it means, yes, it is harder for you than the average person, but it's also kind of a relief because it's an acknowledgement that it is harder for you than the average person. And so there's no point comparing yourself. Oh, my best friend or whatever, she can eat whatever, and it, just falls off her. And with me, all I've got to do is look at her, whatever, and I gain weight. And it's like, you're not imagining it. It's not in your head. That is something that is in your genetics. Now, that doesn't mean, again, it's not letting people off the hook for any particular thing. It's not letting me off the hook for developing my issues. But it's just, I was more likely to develop my issues because of my genetics. Maybe someone else is more likely to be overweight. Someone else is more likely to be depressed. Someone else is more likely to have chronic pain, whatever it may be. Someone else is more likely to have allergies. And it's really helpful to just have compassion with yourself and go, you know what? Even though I'm trying really hard, I still have that issue. That's because it's in my genetics, and I can, stop beating myself up about it and realize it is harder for me than a lot of people. And that's just the way it is.
Yeah, I could also see how this could be really helpful for perimenopausal and menopausal women because so much changes for women during that time that, just the hormone changes alone can change the microbiome, so change your gut health. So you might have never had an issue with something before that now just pops up. And you're going to most likely go to your Western medicine practitioner and they're going to tell you, oh, that's just part of aging. You'll just have to get used to it or deal with it or something else infuriating. So that is absolutely not true. So yeah, I could see how, this information can be so valuable, I feel like, at multiple stages of life. And again, whether you're acutely suffering with something that you want answers to, or you just want to, tweak, or, maybe there's just like this one nagging thing you've never been able to resolve. I think this is also a fabulous tool. And I'm very intrigued and excited about how it sounds like you put the information together and present it and make it usable. Because again, that was one of my frustrations with 23andMe when I did it way back in the day. And just also too, so people are aware, every so often 23andMe goes through and they reconfigure how they will let you access your raw data. So the raw data that I was able to access when I first did the test, like 10 or I don't even know, 12 years ago now, is different than if I want to go back and re-download it again to submit it to a database. And that's what a lot of this is getting a hold of your raw data and then submitting it into a database that spits it out at you. That's like what you described earlier.
Yes.
So keep that in mind too. And then there's other companies that you can submit just your blood sample and they'll do a test, but they will only give you a tiny amount of information back. So I think that's important for people to understand too. If you're out there looking and shopping for some genetic background into your health struggles, keep an eye on how much information you're getting, and then what are they going to do with that information once they have it at their disposal too. I would definitely dig into their privacy policy too. I think that's important.
Yes. 100% agreed. Yeah. Just to go back to your point, I think menopause definitely and premenopause, but pregnancy is another thing that I see often.
Oh, absolutely.
So women, suddenly all these health problems appear and they think it's because they're exhausted, because they're not sleeping and all the rest of it, because of the baby. But then eventually the baby sleeps through the night, child starts going to school, and they still have all these health issues, right? And so I think, in those cases as well, that's a lot of the time where it's really helpful to have that support and realize that, as you just said, it's not like these things have to be permanent. In fact, it's very possible, and this is one of the things I'm committed to help people realize, and the insight I managed to have for myself, and I'm blessed to most of the people around me as well these days, is It's possible even in your 30s, 40s, 50s and beyond to feel better than you ever have. It's not easy. I don't want to pretend it's easy, but it is absolutely possible.
Absolutely. And, I think too, like we get so used to just watching how our family ages that there's certain things that, we're expecting to develop because we saw it happen with our parents or grandparents or, all of our aunts and uncles. But again, like not necessarily set in stone, destined for sure. You have the power and the choice and the ability to create a new future for yourself by accessing your own genetic makeup and making those choices and optimizing it. I think it's wonderfully empowering. And I really wish that, and that's why I do these shows, to get the word out. And so people get curious and they see another opportunity for another avenue to help support their health and well-being. Cool. Is there anything else that we have like maybe 5 or 10 more minutes before we wrap up that you want to bring forward specifically? I mean, we can talk about obviously so many things. We sort of talked about like, the weight loss pathway. Do we want to talk about that more? I think a lot of people are struggling with that.
Yeah, we could do. I'll give you an example where, just reports can be so helpful. So
Okay.
in this day and age, so many people are kind of trying to work out what the best way to eat is, right? And there's a lot of systems out there teaching that this is the one right way. And then there's other systems out there teaching, maybe that you're one of these types, right? You're a fast oxidizer, you're a slow oxidizer, you're a, this blood group or, whatever it might be. My experience is that it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And I know no one wants to hear that, but I'll give an example of this. So, for instance, is keto the best type of diet, or is actually low fat the best type of diet? 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I think low fat was the, trendy one. And these days it's more the keto diet. But, one of the reports that we have, which I often, like to look at, is the carbohydrate report. And there are 3 basic types that we identify. There's the hunter-gatherer type. There's the farmer type on the other extreme, and then there's the intermediate type, the middle type. So if you're a hunter-gatherer type, then any level of carbohydrate is going to be some degree of struggle to your body, and especially if they're simple carbs. And these are the people who are more likely to develop blood sugar issues. But then there is the other type, the farmer type, who is totally fine with carbohydrates, and even simple carbohydrates are perfectly okay to them, within reason, as long as they don't end up with micronutrient deficiency and all the rest of it. And then there's someone in the middle, and I found that to be really helpful to identify that. First of all, because it stops the endless confusion, like which guru do I listen to, and also which study do I listen to. There are studies of people curing themselves of diabetes eating no carbs. That's true, but there are actually also studies of people curing themselves of diabetes eating only carbs, like potato diet, white rice diet, sugar diet, even an almost pure sugar diet helps like heal diabetes. And there's very extensive theories about why both of those are possible, right? One of them blames the excess carbohydrate for creating insulin resistance. One blames the free fatty acids for blocking the insulin receptors and creating insulin resistance. And you're like, if you actually dig into it and you're like listening to all this research, oh my God, who do I listen to? Who do I believe? And
it's overwhelming and confusing and infuriating for some people, I'm sure.
Yeah, and again, most people, we have the time kind of because it's our job, but for most people, who has the time to actually dive into all that research, right? In the end, you're just going to decide who you go with and trust them. The problem is you've got a kind of 50% chance of picking wrong, like
or you just say F it and like you just go on with your life. You're like, whatever, this is too complicated.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people do that some of the time, right? They try and be good and then they go right back to what they were doing before because it doesn't seem to be really working. So anyway, like the carbohydrate report, you just go, oh, I'm the hunter-gatherer type. I can still eat carbs, but they're never going to be great for me, and I really probably should avoid sugars. Or the other type, like I can actually have plenty of carbs. That's not an issue for me. If I'm putting on weight, it's actually probably more likely to be fat. We have reports, do fats agree with you? Do saturated fats specifically agree with you? Do unsaturated fats agree with you? Does protein agree with you? You have, and this is what I mean about the types thing. For some people, their reports come back and say their body's great at processing protein, their body's great at processing fat, all types, and their body's great at processing carbohydrates, even simple carbohydrates. I get other people do the reports, and their body's bad at processing protein, their body's bad at processing all types of fat, and their body's bad at processing carbohydrates. That's life. That's not fair that that's the way it is, that, you know, some people are totally fine with everything. Some people, every fuel source is problematic to them. But again, you know, I had a couple of clients who were like, yeah, I've heard you talk about it, Elwin, and I am the unlucky type. Every single genetic, you know, for the reports, every single fuel source I have a problem with. And I'm like, oh, well, is that true in your experience? Like, yeah, everything I eat seems to cause a problem. I'm like, okay. And so in that case, you know, we've got to work out what's the least harmful form of each of these fuel sources that's not going to be an issue to, you know, with the protein, maybe there's certain amino acids that are more problematic. With the fats, you know, maybe we can get them on MCT oils, which are easier to burn. With the carbohydrate, let's work it out. For some people, it's starches. For some people, it's fructose. For some people, it's whatever. Like, what's the most tolerable? But yeah, so to just step out of that kind of thing where, oh, I'm a follower of this guru, therefore, and you know, I just did it for fuel sources, but it's actually true even for nutrients. You know, I've had people who are like, oh, I heard calcium's really bad for you, and then it causes calcification and like aging and all the rest of it. I'm like, it's bad for some people, and you know what? I used to listen to that, but I actually have a genetically elevated need for calcium, and I was having maybe 200 milligrams of calcium a day for God knows how long, for years, because I wasn't having any dairy and, you know, no other foods. It's like a very high source. The recommended daily amount according to the government is about 1,000 milligrams. And probably I needed even more than that because I have a genetic tendency to need more. So maybe I need 1,500 or 2,000 milligrams. So I was having maybe a tenth of what I should have been having. Turns out that lead competes with calcium for absorption. So one of the reasons why I might have ended up with such high levels of lead is because I was consuming such low levels of calcium. Whenever this may seem like a tangent, but whenever I see someone, I see it reasonably often, who has a high genetic need for both calcium and vitamin K2 specifically, I always say to them, do you like cheese? And they're like, oh yeah, I love it. And they're usually like, I don't eat it because it's bad for me or whatever. I'm like, well, actually, you know, and I look at other factors like saturated fat as well. But if they're okay with saturated fat, I'm like, you know, as long as you don't have an allergy or an intolerance, this may not be the worst thing in the world for you. It's giving you calcium, it's giving you, and, you know, if you want a healthier version of that, maybe you can do, you know, kefir or something like that. I'm saying it has to be cheese, but some kind of fermented dairy may actually be appropriate for you, right? You know, unsaturated fats, there's a lot of stuff these days about how, you know, seed oils are bad for you and unsaturated fats are not as good for you because they get oxidized, and saturated fats are really healthier. Complete flip again of 20 years ago.
Right.
Well, again, in my genetic reports, it says saturated fats are really good for me. And that is the vast majority of what I eat in terms of fat. And it feels great. And fats are good for me in general. But, you know, my co-host on my podcast, Chrissy, saturated fats are bad for her. And unsaturated fats are good for her. And turns out that's exactly what she eats. You know, she goes to monounsaturated, like, you know, olive oil and avocado mainly. So she's still getting a pretty healthy source. But she's heard all the stuff about saturated fats. She's tried having the coconut oil and, you know, all this kind of stuff, but it just doesn't agree with her. And so you could just say, well, oh, and this is all very interesting, but the bottom line is, if you listen to your body, wouldn't you be able to work all this out for yourself? And the answer is, well, kind of maybe, but the thing is, the body actually has to be pretty healthy to give accurate, helpful prompts. And so, you know, an extreme example of this, I used to do drugs back in my heyday. When I was a drug addict, if I checked in on my body about what it needed, it would have said drugs. That doesn't mean that it's accurate. And there are versions of that, right? Like, you may be a hunter-gatherer type who does not benefit from sugar, but when you check in with your body, it may say, I want sugar, you know, or whatever. So we have to, like, and so because we can't always trust our bodies for various reasons, it's like, well, what do we trust? And so I think a lot of the time we trust maybe snippets that we read in the newspaper or see on TV, or maybe we were a follower of some kind of guru, some kind of school of thought about, oh, veganism is good, or carnivore is good, or keto is good, or whatever. But I would suggest that an upgrade from all of that is to actually learn about your genetics, and then also do testing with a functional practitioners like yourself. Like, I'm a big fan of the test, the NutrEval, for instance, right? Because rather than guessing how much you need of all these different vitamins, you know, some minerals, some amino acids, essential fats, you're actually testing to see what do you actually need. So to me, that's like the gold standard, that like the combination of something like a NutrEval plus genetic testing, that will give you proper guidance. And it may seem quite expensive, specifically the NutriVal. I mean, our service is pretty, affordable, but it may seem quite expensive compared to just buying a book by some guru. But if you, or reading something free online in a magazine or whatever. But actually, if you think about how important it is to feel good, like when you have energy, how much more you're able to get accomplished, how much more productive you're able to be. And of course, in the US, how much money you save on healthcare over time by not having these health issues. It's actually, pretty much the best money you can spend, and something I wish I'd have done before. When I thought I was just living a healthy lifestyle, I had no alcohol, no cigarettes, no fast food, no processed food, no tap water, no this, no inorganic clothing. I mean, everything I was doing, all the stuff you're supposed to do, and I still got sick because I didn't have this basic information about what my nutritional needs were and what my toxin sensitivities were. And so I think this is extremely helpful information.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, also like the time and the money that we all have spent seeking and trying all the things. I mean, sure, you can try all the things, but if you could just do a test and figure it out and like have your own personal blueprint, like why not do it that way? Like I don't think there's anything wrong with shortcuts if they're with, great information that that you can immediately implement. So tell us where your company lives. It's called Genetic Insights. How they can get in and start utilizing all the resources you have.
Yeah, thank you. Geneticinsights.co. That's genetic insights, plural, .co, not .com, .co. I also have another website called feelyounger.net, which is where there's an information resource, and I have a few supplements which are commonly supportive of feeling younger. And then there's my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Elwin Robinson. I have the Rejuvenate podcast, which is also available on all podcast platforms. And on the podcast, everything obviously is free, and I have like complete guides to all kinds of issues, whether it's oral health, whether it's weight loss, whether it's thyroid, whether it's chronic gut infections, whatever it might be. Like I have specific episodes about how to address each specific issue. So you may not want to listen to every episode of my podcast, but if there's a specific issue that you would like my take on how to resolve, then check out the podcast. For geneticinsights.co, we have a special 25% off for your listeners with coupon code Dr. May. That's DRMAY. If you use that coupon code, so 25% off. And just to speak very briefly about the company, that, as I said, I was already helped by a different service a few years ago. So why did I create my own when that was already so helpful to me? Two main reasons. First of all, I wanted my service to be a bit simpler to use because, as you know, Dr. May, a lot of these platforms are very complicated and they're more geared towards health professionals. When I showed it to an MD that I work with, she was like, "Oh, this is great. This is like I don't have to write reports about the reports anymore. I can just give it to the person and they can understand it." It's like, yeah, that's what we're going for. So that was one reason, to make it simple and practical for people. And the other reason was actually to make it more affordable. So as far as I know, we're the most affordable platform by far that has the kind of level of information that we have. The very highest cost is $197. Plus then 25% off you can get. And for a lot of our collections, like if you want the weight loss collection, the blood sugar collection, the heart health collection, whatever, it's between $45 and $65.
Beautiful.
So very affordable is the other goal.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And make sure everybody you check out his podcast, because I always like to support other practitioners and people that are putting amazing and helpful information out there. So it's the Rejuvenate podcast, like he said. And again, the website is geneticinsights.co. And then what was the other one you said?
There's also feelyounger.net.
Feelyounger.net. Perfect. Thank you so much. We appreciate everything you're doing, and I feel like we could talk about this all day long. So maybe we'll talk off air about maybe, disease or in condition specific episodes to do in the future. So thank you. And everybody definitely check out geneticinsights.co, and that coupon code was Dr. May, DRMAY. And thank you guys. We'll catch you on the next episode.